I stood on the porch, clutching a warm casserole dish, steam fogging the glass lid. The shawl around my shoulders still smelled faintly of my late husband's cologne. The door creaked open, just a sliver. My daughter-in-law's eyes swept over me. "Actually," she said with a plastic smile, "we're keeping it just immediate family today. Do you mind waiting outside?" My son sat behind her, scrolling his phone. Never looked up. What they didn't know? The house they shut me out of still belonged to me. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. I wasn't always the woman left standing on a porch with nowhere to go. Before everything changed, I was someone's wife, someone's mother. I was the kind of woman who showed up early, stayed late, and baked extra just in case a neighbor stopped by. My name is Evelyn Hart, 63 years old, former librarian, widow, and according to my daughter-in-law, apparently, an inconvenience. But that wasn't always the case. When my husband Richard and I bought that house nearly 40 years ago, we weren't thinking about property values or inheritance. We were in love, standing on a patch of overgrown grass, picturing children's laughter echoing through those halls. The floors creaked and the walls held the scent of old books, but we didn't care. We built our life there one quiet morning at a time. He painted the porch swing while I planted tulips along the walkway. That house was our promise. When Richard passed away, 5 years ago, sudden heart attack, I thought the world had stopped. My son Mark was the one who held me up at the funeral. He was always a sweet boy, sensitive. He looked just like his father did at that age, and for a while, that resemblance was the only thing keeping me breathing. We leaned on each other after the funeral. He moved back home briefly, said he didn't want me to be alone. I cooked us dinner every night. He left notes on the counter thanking me for keeping the world turning. He was always brilliant, even as a child. I still remember when he got accepted into law school. He came running into the kitchen waving the acceptance letter, eyes wide with disbelief. I cried right there on the linoleum. His father and I didn't have much, but we'd saved what we could. I even picked up weekend shifts at the library to help with tuition. We never told him how tight things got, so when Mark met Julia, his now wife, I was happy for him. She was confident, polished, said all the right things, the kind of girl who wore heels even to brunch and never forgot a name. But I noticed things early on. The way she wrinkled her nose at my curtains, how she accidentally forgot to include me in dinner reservations, or how she talked about family but never asked about mine. Still, I told myself not to judge. Maybe she was just nervous. I'd seen enough movies to know how the difficult mother-in-law trope went. I didn't want to become that. When they got married, I offered them the house. Mark had just started his firm, and Julia was in between. Jobs. The house was paid off, and I figured, why not let them stay there a while? I could move into the guest room, save them from rent, give them a chance to start off strong. I never told them I'd kept the deed in my name. It didn't feel necessary. We were family. And for a while, it worked. I cooked. I helped clean. I took Julia to her appointments when she was pregnant. I was there when they brought little Ellie home from the hospital. I rocked that baby to sleep more nights than I can count. I became the quiet presence in the background, always one room away, always available. But slowly, things shifted. My casserole recipes were too heavy. My bedtime stories were too old-fashioned. My opinion? Rarely asked for. At first I thought I was imagining it, the polite corrections, the disapproving glances, but then came the real cuts. Julia removed my wedding photo from the hallway to make space for more modern pieces. The house started to look less like mine and more like a magazine spread. My floral teacups were boxed up. My husband's framed fishing license ended, up in the garage. And Mark? He noticed, but didn't say much. Maybe he thought keeping the peace meant keeping silent. Maybe he didn't want to upset Julia. But every time he looked away, a little more of our bond unraveled. Still, I stayed. I told myself I was needed, but need and appreciation, those are different things. That brings us back to the porch. The casserole, the plastic smile. I wasn't family enough to step inside, but I was still the woman who paid the property taxes every year. Still the woman whose name was etched on the deed. They had forgotten. I had not. I thought giving them a home would build a bridge. I didn't know I was digging my own grave, one polite smile at a time. After that afternoon on the porch, I sat alone at the small bench tucked beneath the willow tree in the backyard. It was the same bench where I used to shell peas with my mother, the same spot where Richard once kissed my cheek and promised, "This house will always be our safe place." I clutched that casserole dish like it was a lifeline, my hands trembling. Not from anger, but from the sheer weight of invisibility. You don't become invisible all at once. It happens in inches. In the first few months after Mark and Julia moved in, things were cordial, even warm at times. Julia would ask me to pick up groceries when she was busy, or watch Ellie for an hour while she caught up on work. I told myself that was normal, that being helpful was part of the bargain. After all, they were trying to build their lives. I had already lived most of mine. But little by little, my role began to shrink, not into a room, but into a silence. Started to notice how things I loved slowly disappeared. The lace curtains Richard hung on our first anniversary were quietly replaced with gray blackout panels. A crocheted table runner I'd spent 3 weeks stitching ended up in the donation box. "Oh, it just didn't match the color palette," Julia had said with a tight laugh. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with a friend. "Yes, it's a beautiful old house. We're updating it room by room. It just needed a little modern touch. Not my husband's family home, not the place his mother built with her hands, just theirs, and old." When I brought it up to Mark, gently over tea, he shrugged. "You know she's particular. Try not to take it personally, Mom." But it was personal. Every photograph removed, every item boxed up without asking. It wasn't redecorating. It was rewriting history. Then came the slow erasure of daily presence. I used to make Sunday breakfasts, eggs, biscuits, peach preserves from the pantry. One Sunday, I woke up to find Julia had ordered brunch for them on an app. "We figured you'd want to sleep in," she said, barely glancing up. The food came in glossy boxes with sleek branding. No dishes to wash, no smells in the kitchen. Nothing left of the ritual. They began holding dinner parties, hosting friends from Mark's firm. I would help prepare hors d'oeuvres, arrange flowers, set the table. But when the doorbell rang, Julia would look me over and say, "Why don't you take a break upstairs, Evelyn? You must be exhausted." As if I were the help. As if I hadn't built the very room she was entertaining in. I remember one particular evening. The house was full of laughter and clinking glasses, the living room buzzing with stylish people discussing market trends and vacation homes. I stood just beyond the hallway, half hidden, listening. A guest asked Julia, "How did you get this place? It's gorgeous." "Oh," she said, chuckling, "we were lucky. The timing was just right." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about modern curtains or new routines. Julia was rewriting the origin story. She was scrubbing me out of it entirely. The shift became sharper once Ellie turned 3. Julia started interviewing for preschool programs. She rarely involved me in decisions anymore. I offered to help with applications, having worked decades with literacy programs. Julia smiled politely and said, "We've got it covered." Just like that. But what hurt most wasn't Julia's coldness. It was Mark's silence, his quiet nods, his distracted eyes. He had become fluent in the language of avoidance. One afternoon, I overheard them arguing behind the closed kitchen door. Julia hissed, "It's our home now, Mark. She needs to start respecting boundaries." Our home. The phrase rang through me like a bell toll. They never asked for the deed. They never needed to, because I had offered the space with love. And love, I was learning, could be the very thing used to erase you. And yet, I stayed. I played with Ellie in the garden, read her bedtime stories, tied her shoelaces. She never saw me as less than. Not yet. But I feared one day she would, just as her mother did, polite, distant, unconcerned with my name on the mailbox. Late one night, I walked quietly into the living room, where I kept a small antique desk tucked in the corner. I opened the drawer where I kept important documents. The deed was still there. My name, my signature. Not theirs. I looked around that room, Julia's sleek vases, the cold lighting, the rug that clashed with the wooden floors Richard and I had polished by hand. It no longer looked like my home, but legally, it still was. They erased my name from their mouths, but it was still carved into the paper that owned their walls. The moment everything shifted from subtle to sharp happened during a family dinner I was asked to cook, but not attend. It was a Friday evening, one of those golden, honey-lit nights in early autumn. I'd spent the better part of the day in the kitchen, roasting chicken with rosemary, whipping potatoes with garlic cream, and baking my late husband's favorite cornbread recipe, Mark's childhood favorite too. The table gleamed with silverware. I had polished by hand. I even put a little ribbon around Ellie's napkin like I used to do when Mark was small. As I was setting the final dish down, Julia walked in, dressed in her tailored black sheath dress and stilettos sharp enough to cut. Glass. She glanced at the table, then at me. Oh good, you're done. The guests should be arriving soon. Should I change? I asked, wiping my hands nervously on a tea towel. Julia blinked. Change? For dinner. I thought I'd sit with everyone tonight. She paused, her tone careful and light. Actually, it's just Mark's colleagues tonight. Kind of a work thing, you know? Don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I stood there, tea towel in hand, apron still tied around my waist. But I made everything, I said softly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. And it smells amazing. You're the best, Evelyn. She picked up a tray of wine glasses and turned. I wasn't dismissed verbally, but I wasn't invited either. So I did what was expected of me. I backed away. I took my plate into the kitchen and sat alone at the counter, listening to the laughter through the thin wall. At one point, I heard Julia say, Mark and I are finally making this house our own. It's taken a while, but it's worth it. Our own. That phrase again. A splinter, sharp under skin. After the guests left and the house had quieted down, I cleaned up the dishes no one thanked me for and walked outside to the garden. The moonlight hit the bench by the willow just right, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat there, hands folded, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. It was around that time that I began noticing more changes. The guest room I had moved into after they returned from the hospital with Ellie was now being described as the storage space. Julia began referring to the upstairs bathroom as our private one, meaning I should use the one in the laundry hallway, where we once kept the mop. One afternoon, I found a box marked donation filled with things that weren't hers to give. Richard's favorite flannel, the blue teacups we bought on our 30th anniversary trip to Asheville, and a framed poem my son had written for me in second grade. When I pulled it out, Julia walked in. Oh, she said, her voice breezy. I thought you'd cleared that stuff out already. My fingers tightened around the frame. This poem. My son gave me this. She shrugged. It's just old paper, Evelyn. Just old paper. I placed the frame back in the box, gently, not because I agreed, but because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. The final straw, though, came when I was asked to watch Ellie on short notice. Mark had a client dinner, and Julia had a yoga retreat. I said yes, of course. I always said yes. Ellie and I made pancakes, painted with watercolors, and snuggled on the couch watching The Sound of Music. But when they returned, something was different. Julia came in first, walked right past me, scooped Ellie up and said, "Oh, thank God you're okay." I get so anxious when I leave her with older people. I blinked. Excuse me? She didn't answer, just kissed Ellie's head and walked upstairs. Mark followed moments later. I expected him to say something, anything, but all he said was, "Thanks, Mom," as he patted my arm and disappeared up the stairs too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out the manila folder where I kept all the legal documents. I flipped past the life insurance, the funeral receipts, the will, and there it was, the deed, to my home, still in my name, unchanged, undisputed, undiscussed. They'd made renovations, sure. They'd painted, replaced fixtures, and added some landscaping. But they hadn't touched the ownership. Not legally, not even close. A week later, I received a subtle yet unmistakable blow. I had planned a Sunday dinner, one last attempt to bring warmth back into the home. I set the table, made roast beef, Ellie's favorite honey carrots, and even brought out the embroidered tablecloth I'd been saving since Richard's passing. Mark came downstairs looking tense. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Julia, thinks we should start doing dinner just the three of us. You know, her, me, and Ellie." I nodded slowly. "Of course," I said. "You'll want your privacy." He hesitated. "It's not personal. It always is." I cleared the table that night before they even sat down. I ate a bowl of soup in the laundry hallway. That's when I realized it wasn't just that I didn't belong. It was that they had already started pretending I didn't live there at all. They boxed up my memories like clutter, unaware that I held the papers that could box up their lives just as easily. The night I broke didn't come with shouting. There was no slamming of doors, no final straw so sharp it sliced through my dignity in one clean sweep. It came quietly, like a draft under a door you didn't realize was open. It started with a picture. I had gone upstairs to grab a clean towel for Ellie's bath, and on my way back down, I noticed a stack of old photo albums in the hallway linen closet. They'd been moved there without a word. Once displayed in the living room cabinet Richard built by hand, now hidden behind folded sheets and spare batteries. I pulled one out and sat down on the hallway floor. Dust floated through a slant of evening light, page after page of moments. Mark's second birthday, frosting smeared across his face, Richard holding him up at the edge of the lake, sunlight in their eyes. Me, in the old blue dress I wore until the fabric thinned, laughing over a picnic blanket. Tears welled up. But I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I turned the page and found a photo I hadn't seen in years. Me standing on the porch, Richard beside me, holding the freshly signed deed to our home. His handwriting was scrawled on the back. July 3rd. It's ours. Forever. Flashback. It was a hot summer afternoon when we signed the papers. The real estate office had box fans in the windows and coffee that tasted like metal, but we were giddy. Richard had worn a button-down shirt too big in the shoulders, and I had forgotten my pen. We borrowed one from the receptionist, and as we signed page after page, I remember Richard gripping my hand and whispering, "This house will hold everything we ever love." That night, we brought sandwiches and a bottle of cheap wine to the empty living room. We sat on the floor, toasting to peeling wallpaper and good bones. We hadn't even bought curtains yet. Back in the present, the album slipped from my lap, the pages fanning out on the floor. Downstairs, I heard voices, Julia and Mark. "Why is she still here, Mark? She's practically living in the walls. It's creepy." "She's my mother, Julia. She raised me in this house. She lives in the laundry hallway." I froze. My body didn't react, only my breath changed. Quieter. Shallower. Mark said nothing after that, and that silence hurt more than anything Julia could ever say. Later that night, I stood alone in the kitchen, barefoot, the lights dim. I opened the cabinet above the fridge, where we used to keep the important things. The folder was still. There, slightly bent, wrapped in a rubber band, I pulled it down and placed it on the table like an altar. The deed stared back at me. My name, not Mark and Julia, just Evelyn Hart, sole owner. Flashback. Another memory rose, uninvited. Richard. And I sitting at the dining table, Ellie wasn't even born yet, discussing what would happen if something ever happened to one of us. He had insisted I keep the house in my name alone after he was gone. I trust you, he had said, his hand over mine. If anything ever feels wrong, promise me you'll protect what we built. At the time, I laughed. You think I'm going to throw our son out one day? Richard's eyes didn't waver. I think you'll know when love stops feeling like love, Evie. And when it does, you'll know what to do. I sat at that kitchen table for over an hour that night, listening to the creaks of the house, the faint hum of Ellie's white noise machine upstairs, and the mechanical buzz of the fridge. I had spent 5 years thinking I was preserving a family. But I wasn't. I was being slowly excised from one. It wasn't the erasure that broke me. It was the fact that I had let them do it, all because I was afraid that if I stood up for myself, I'd lose the last people I had left. But I already had. Mark didn't speak up for me. Julia didn't see me. And I had stopped seeing myself until that night. I took the deed, slid it into a protective sleeve, and placed it in my desk drawer, on top this time, not beneath. And then I went into the hallway, opened the linen closet, and pulled out every photo album they had hidden. One by one, I brought them back to the living room. The bookshelf they had turned into a wine rack. I emptied it. I filled the shelves with my history. Our history. Theirs too, if they still wanted to claim it. The next morning, Julia walked into the living room and stopped short. She stared at the bookshelf, eyes narrowing. "What's this?" "Memories," I said, sipping my tea. "They were never yours, to throw away." Have you ever been left out like that, in a house you built with love? Tell me in the comments. They thought I wouldn't fight, because I was quiet. But grief had taught me something stronger than rage: resolve. The morning after I filled the bookshelf with old photographs and history they tried to erase, I made a full breakfast. Not for them, for myself. 2 scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and fresh coffee in the porcelain cup Richard gave me on our 20th anniversary. I sat at the head of the dining table, the same spot I had given up months ago, and watched the steam rise from my plate as sun poured in through the window. Julia walked by once, gave a sharp glance at the table, and said nothing. Mark passed, by 10 minutes later, and paused. "You made breakfast?" I looked at him, calm. "I did. For everyone?" "No," I said, lifting my fork. "Just for me." It wasn't meant to be a punishment. It was a boundary. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to apologize for taking up space in my own home. That week, I started to step back, not from Ellie, not from love, but from servitude. I declined to make dinner on Wednesday. Julia stared at me blankly when I said, "You have a beautiful kitchen. I'm sure you'll manage just fine." I stopped folding their laundry. I left their mail unopened, their groceries unordered. Slowly, I removed myself from the invisible list of unpaid obligations I had allowed myself to be buried under. Julia didn't like it. She began leaving passive-aggressive reminders on sticky notes. "Please wipe down counters after use. Try not to run the washer during Ellie's nap. Use the side entrance if we have guests." Mark didn't intervene. But he noticed. He began offering small gestures, a cup of tea in the evenings, a "thanks, Mom," after I helped Ellie with her homework. One afternoon, he even asked if I wanted to go with him to the grocery store. I said no. I wasn't being cruel. I was rediscovering my spine. It had been asleep beneath grief and obligation for too long. That weekend, I drove to the next town over and visited an old friend, Carolyn, a retired attorney I used to work with at the library. She now ran a legal support center for widows and older women. We sat at a corner cafe sipping Earl Grey, her nails still perfectly manicured like they always were. I pulled out the deed from my purse and slid it across the table. "Still in your name," she confirmed, flipping through the pages. "No title transfer, no quitclaim. Nothing. This house is still legally and wholly yours, Evelyn." I nodded, my breath steady. "I need to know what my rights are, and what my options might be if this living situation becomes unsustainable." Carolyn gave a small smile, not smug, supportive. "You're smart to ask now." She offered to draw up documents to protect my rights, just in case. We discussed quiet steps I could take, should I need them. When I left that cafe, I didn't feel angry. I felt prepared. Back at home, I began reclaiming small pieces of myself. I joined a quilting group at the church down the road, women around my age who met every Thursday to work on shared projects. They laughed, shared stories about stubborn grandchildren and arthritic knees, and welcomed me like I hadn't felt in years. I also started an Etsy shop, just a small one, for handmade bookmarks and embroidered tea towels. It felt silly at first, but the first time someone left a review calling my work soulful, I wept alone at my desk. I had something that belonged only to me again. Ellie noticed the shift before anyone else. One afternoon, as I folded her tiny socks in the laundry room, she sat cross-legged on the floor and asked, "Grandma, are you happy?" I paused, looked down at her small, curious face. "I think I'm remembering how to be." One night, Julia made a passing comment at dinner, something like, "We've been talking about doing some renovations in the spring, maybe knocking down the sunroom." I looked up from my book and said quietly, "Not without my written approval." She blinked. "Excuse me?" I met her eyes calmly. "It's not your house to renovate." She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then turned to Mark. "Can you talk to her, please?" Mark looked between us. His silence, for once, was not passive. He didn't defend her. He didn't argue. He just looked down at his plate. That was the moment I knew. He remembered. Somewhere deep in him, the boy who used to bring me dandelions and whisper, "Thank you for everything, Mom," still lived. The next morning, I sat at the piano, one I hadn't touched in over a year, and played a few soft notes. The air vibrated. Gently, like the house was sighing with relief. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake, and that was far more dangerous than any rage I could have thrown their way. They thought I was retreating into silence, but I was stepping into strength, one quiet decision at a time. It began with sawdust in the air. I returned home, from my Thursday quilting circle, to find the side gate propped open, a contractor's van parked in the driveway, and the faint thrum of hammering inside the house. For a brief moment, I thought I had pulled into the wrong address, but no, it was my front lawn, my porch, my hydrangeas trampled by boot prints. Inside, 3 men in dusty jeans were prying up floorboards in the sunroom. "Can I help you?" I asked, setting my bag down carefully by the door. A man in a red ball cap looked up, unfazed. "We're here for the remodel. Tearing this out for the new office/playroom should only take a week or 2. I stood frozen. My throat went dry. Julia appeared a moment later, holding her phone in one hand, wearing yoga pants and a smug smile. "Oh, Evelyn, you're back. I meant to tell you. Mark and I decided to finally redo the sunroom. It's just not functional, and we really need the space. You don't mind, do you?" She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she turned and began directing the workers again, like she owned the ground she stood on. I followed her into the hallway, calm but unwavering. "Julia, did you file a permit for this work?" She paused. "What? You can't legally alter the structure of a property you don't own without permission from the title holder. Did you file a permit with my signature?" The color drained slightly from her face. "Mark said—" I raised a brow. "Did you? No, but then kindly have them stop." The hammers paused as I stepped back into the sunroom and addressed the workers directly. "Gentlemen, you'll need to leave. The project has not been authorized by the legal owner of this house. There was a moment of confusion. Then one of them said, "Ma'am, if you own the property, we'll have to confirm before continuing." "Feel free to call the county clerk," I said, opening my wallet and removing a photocopy of the deed. It wasn't rage in my voice, it was authority. And for the first time in months, even Julia recognized it. They packed up their tools and left within the hour. Mark came home later that evening, tie loosened, jaw tense. "Why did you stop the renovations?" he asked, standing in the doorway of my room, the laundry hallway room. I looked up from my embroidery. "Because no one asked, and because I legally have the right to deny it." He rubbed his temple. "You could have come to me." "I did, Mark, for years. But you weren't listening." He didn't argue. He just stood there. And for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in his eyes in months. Shame. Over the next week, the air in the house thickened. Julia tried everything, sweetness, then sarcasm, then silence. But I stayed steady. I moved through the house like a ghost that refused to vanish. I cooked only for myself. I watched my shows. I greeted Ellie with warmth, but offered no favors to anyone else. Then came the envelope. It was left on my dresser one morning, neatly sealed. Inside was a typed letter from Mark and Julia, a proposed transition plan. It laid out their intention to purchase the house from me at fair market value, suggested a 6-month timeline for relocation, and even included a line about minimizing Ellie's emotional disruption. There was no offer, no apology, just paperwork and polite arrogance. I walked into the living room and placed the letter in front of Mark while Julia stood nearby, arms crossed. "I'm not selling," Julia scoffed. "Evelyn, come on, this house isn't right for you anymore. You need peace. We can help with that." "I have peace," I said. "What I don't have is patience for people who mistake generosity for weakness." Mark finally spoke. "We just want what's best for the family." "No," I said, voice quiet. "You want what's best for yourselves." I turned and walked away. That night, I drafted my own letter with the help of Carolyn. It wasn't loud or cruel. It was clear, factual, and final. Effective immediately, I was revoking their permission to reside in my home. They had 60 days to vacate. I handed it to Mark the next morning. He didn't speak, just took it, read it once, and sat down. Julia erupted. "You can't be serious. Where do you expect us to go? We live here." I looked her in the eye and said, "So did I. Until you made sure I didn't." She turned to Mark for backup, but he said nothing. The unraveling had begun. The next weeks were filled with cold silences, hurried footsteps, and awkward breakfasts. Boxes began stacking up near the stairs. Julia no longer made eye contact. Mark lingered longer near my door but said little. Ellie sensed the change. "Grandma, are you mad at Mommy?" "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "I'm just remembering who I am." 2 days before they moved out, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. "I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. You didn't deserve any of it." "Mark," I folded it and tucked it into the same drawer where I kept Richard's last birthday card. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. That was enough, for now. They tried to force me out of my own story. Instead, I gave them a deadline and a door. The morning of the move, the house was silent. No cartoons on the TV. No Ellie's squeaky footsteps. No scent of French vanilla candles. Julia had packed them already. The energy was heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Only now, I was the one standing beneath the umbrella, not the one getting drenched. I woke before dawn, took my time making tea, and watched the sunrise through the kitchen window. It spilled soft orange light across the counters I had scrubbed clean for over 3 decades. This was my ritual now, not waiting for their approval, but honoring my own presence. By 9 a.m., the moving van had arrived. Boxes thudded onto the porch. Suitcases lined the hallway. Ellie sat on the bottom stair, clutching a stuffed rabbit, watching. Everything with wide, uncertain eyes. Mark moved robotically, lifting, carrying, taping shut, his face unreadable. Julia barked instructions at the movers, her voice clipped, businesslike. Not once did she speak to me. Not once did she apologize. I didn't expect her to, because apologies require reflection, and some people prefer mirrors that never tell the truth. At one point, she passed me in the hallway, arms full of coats. Her shoulder brushed mine, no words, just that cold tension of someone who knows they lost and still believes it's unfair. But the moment that will stay with me happened. Just after noon, they had cleared most of the living room. The house echoed now, the walls bare except for the one bookshelf I had quietly refilled, the only remaining trace of our history. I stood beside it, running my fingers across the spines. Mark entered, holding a box labeled Ellie Books. He paused beside me, hesitant. "She'll miss you," he said. I turned, meeting his eyes. "You could have stopped this, Mark. You could have spoken up." He nodded. "I know." Silence. "I didn't want to choose sides," he said, barely above a whisper. "But you did," I replied. "You just chose by standing still." He looked down at the floor, the same floor he had crawled across as a baby, raced across in socks, as a child, and stomped across now as a man caught between guilt and regret. "I didn't know she was going to push so far," he said. "No," I said gently. "You just hoped I'd endure it." There was no malice in my tone. Just the soft, tired truth. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the silence or for the leaving?" He hesitated. "Both." I gave a small nod. "You'll be all right." He blinked. "What about you?" "I already am." Outside, Julia was talking to the movers about boxes marked fragile. I watched her for a moment, tall, composed, polished. But the house didn't cling to her. There was no imprint of her spirit in these walls, only disruption, only erasure. She walked toward the van, opened the door, and turned back one last time. I stood on the porch, my shawl wrapped tight, arms crossed. We locked eyes. She didn't wave. Neither did I. Ellie was the last to leave. Mark bent down to buckle her into the back seat, but she squirmed and looked over his shoulder. "Grandma," she called. "Are you coming?" I walked forward and knelt beside the car. "No, honey," I said. "But I'll see you soon, okay? You can come visit whenever you want." She looked confused. "But this is your house." I smiled, brushing her bangs from her forehead. "It still is. That's why it'll be here waiting." She nodded solemnly, the way only children can, accepting things even when they don't understand. Mark closed the car door gently. When they drove away, I didn't go back inside immediately. I stood on the porch where I had once been told to. Wait outside, same boards, same railing, same light. Only this time I wasn't holding a casserole. I wasn't hoping for acceptance. I wasn't asking for space. I was the space. Inside, the house breathed again. I opened the windows and let the wind move through every corner, stirring curtains that had once been boxed away. The emptiness felt like clarity, not loss. Room by room, I began the slow process of re-inhabiting, not redecorating, but reclaiming. I pulled Richard's military medals out from the garage and mounted them back above the fireplace. I rehung the family photo taken in 1992, the one Julia had quietly replaced with abstract art. I returned my blue and white china to its glass case, polished and proud. I put Ellie's crayon drawings back on the fridge, because this was still her home, too. That evening, I sat in the sunroom, still intact, and watched the shadows stretch long across the garden. I had dinner alone, a simple plate of chicken and rice with sweet tea and a slice of lemon pie. I ate slowly, savoring every bite. I didn't feel victorious. I felt restored. There's a difference. Victory needs someone to lose. Restoration only needs space to breathe. They drove away believing they'd been defeated. But I hadn't fought. A war. I'd just come home to myself. The first morning after they left, the house exhaled. It was subtle, no dramatic thunderclap or fireworks. Just the quiet creak of a home realigning itself after being held too tightly by people who didn't understand its heartbeat. I walked barefoot down the hallway, letting the soles of my feet meet the wood like they used to when Richard would. Chase Mark down those same planks, pretending to be a monster with oven mitts for claws. I made coffee and sipped it in the silence. Not a lonely silence, a clean one. A silence with room for memory. I began with the garden. It had gone neglected while I was too busy folding towels that weren't mine and standing aside in rooms I used to belong to. The roses Richard planted were almost strangled by weeds, but I spent the next 3 afternoons on my knees, pruning and watering, humming as I worked. By the 4th day, 2 small blooms returned, pink and defiant. I smiled, because I knew exactly how that felt. Word spread slowly around town. A few neighbors stopped by to check in. They didn't say it outright, but they knew something had shifted. There's a particular look women give each other when they sense someone has finally stopped shrinking. My church group welcomed me back with open arms. I didn't offer too much about what happened. I didn't need to. Sometimes all a woman has to say is, "I remembered who I was." The rest writes itself in knowing nods and soft smiles. Carolyn, my old friend and legal confidant, came by one Saturday with muffins and a stack of paperwork. "Just the final protections we discussed," she said, sipping tea. "I've drafted a trust. The house remains yours until your last breath. Then it transfers, in full, to Ellie." I nodded, already emotional. "You don't owe them the bricks," she said. "But the girl, she deserves the roots." And she was right. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Mark. It was handwritten. 2 full pages. He apologized, not just for Julia, or for the silence, or for letting things slide. He apologized. For forgetting who I was outside of Mom. For failing to see the sacrifices, the quiet loyalty, the weight I'd carried long before his wife ever entered the picture. "I thought I was building my own life," he wrote. "But I didn't. Realize I was dismantling yours to do it." He ended with, "I don't know if you'll ever let me back in, but I hope one day, when the house smells like cinnamon again, you'll let me knock." I folded the letter and tucked it in the same drawer where Richard's deed lived. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not because I was angry, because I was still healing. Ellie visited 2 Sundays later. Mark brought her, and I noticed he didn't walk past the porch. He stood at the bottom step, hands in his pockets, respectful. "I'll pick her up at 5, he said softly. "If that's okay?" I nodded. He turned to go, but paused. "She misses you." "I know," I said. "I missed her first." Ellie and I baked sugar cookies. We danced in the kitchen to old jazz records. She asked why the house was so much quieter now, and I told her, sometimes quiet is where love gets loud again. When Mark returned, he lingered at the door. I handed him a small tin of cookies. No words, just a gesture. That was enough. Not everything needs a perfect bow to be resolved. Sometimes the thread just loosens a bit, and that's peace enough. I began opening the house again, hosting Sunday teas, sewing with my quilting group in the living room, where laughter lived again. I even started offering piano lessons to 2 girls from the church. The same piano I once feared would never be touched again now played daily. Its keys warm under my fingertips. The house was alive, not because it was full of people, because it was finally full of purpose. The greatest revelation wasn't that I still had the deed. It was that I had always had the power to walk away with it. All I had to do was remember it wasn't love to be tolerated. It was love to be respected. Would you have walked away like I did? Or knocked one more time? Let me know below. They packed up and left, thinking the house was empty. But what remained was far more valuable than anything they carried out. Me. People think the hardest part is losing something, but it isn't. The hardest part is realizing you lost yourself piece by piece. Through every moment you chose silence over confrontation, tolerance over truth, and duty over dignity. I didn't leave that house. I stayed, because it was never about the bricks or the roof or the deed with my name. It was about remembering that I didn't owe anyone my erasure to earn a seat at my own table. Looking back, I see it now in flashes. The casserole dish going, cold in my hands. The door clicking shut behind me. My son scrolling his phone like I was part of the background. And then the sound of my own footsteps, walking not away in defeat, but towards something. Myself. There's a quiet power in that. It doesn't look like yelling. It doesn't sound like slamming doors. It feels like peace settling into your bones, finally unbothered by who does or doesn't understand you. I've learned something in these past months. You don't need to be invited to your own life. You just need to stop asking permission. There's a kind of aging the world doesn't talk about, the kind where women like me are expected to fade into corners, cook in silence, and hand down keys without questions. But I wasn't born to be the warm body on standby. I wasn't raised to be grateful for crumbs when I built the whole table. To the women watching this who feel the slow burn of being dismissed, whether by your family, your children, or the very people you loved into success, I want to say this. You are not a burden. You are not too much. You are not in the way. You are the very reason the ground doesn't crack beneath them. And if they forget that, you don't scream. You don't beg. You remember. You stand up, you straighten your back, and you decide on your own terms how your story will continue. My home is quiet now. Not empty, just right. The garden is blooming again. The hallways smell of lemon oil and cinnamon. The guest room has been transformed into my reading den. Ellie's drawings still decorate the fridge. There's music most nights, soft jazz, gospel, sometimes just the sound of my needle stitching through fabric as I sit with the women who have become my second family. I host Sunday tea again. I laugh louder now. I wear lipstick even if no one's coming over. Just because I want to, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear little feet racing across the porch. That's when I know Ellie's back. She comes in with wildflowers and new stories, and I make her hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. When she asks me about the house, I tell her, one day this will be yours. But not because anyone handed it to her, because she'll learn what it means to protect what matters, just like I finally did. If you had told me that being asked to wait outside would be the thing that set me free, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am, older, wiser, stronger, not bitter, just better, not broken, just rebuilt. One quiet room at a time. So no, I never knocked on that door again. I didn't need to, because I already had the keys, and this time I wasn't handing them over. Sometimes they don't realize they shut out the very woman who built the walls holding them up. And when they do, well, by then, you're already gone.